Also, challenge your own assumptions. This means, make sure that, allow yourself to be disrupted a little bit. Make sure you speak from your own point of view rather than on behalf of entire communities. Usually it's more accurate that way. And for this program, there is no wrong answer. We're trying to see how people think, how we ourselves think, and through sharing these stories together. So without further ado.
Can I jump in just for one quick second, Jeremy?
Yes, you can.
I would just like to honor that this is our first partnership for this program between the Brooks Institute and the Tri-Faith Initiative. And so thank you, Rabbi Stoller, for your leadership in bringing us together and collaborating on this. And to Miriam, thank you for being here to join us today and for honoring your parents. And I think they'd be proud that we were on Zoom gathering, doing this work of hearing each other and studying next to each other. So
I think they would love it. This is what they wanted.
Great.
So thank you.
So the silver lining of COVID, we have learned to be able to gather in these kinds of spaces. And so it is exceptional that we're doing it in a new way, in a new time. And to Jeremy and Rebecca, thank you for the time to prepare and to guide us through this. So welcome everyone, and let's move forward.
And one last note, remember we have this monthly, and next month, Ben Mazer from Temple Israel will be leading a conversation. We haven't picked out a topic yet, but make sure to keep track of what we do. And I'll actually send a recap soon with those details as well. So Rebecca, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Hello, I am Rebecca Morello, and I am the Director of Youth and Family Ministries at Countryside. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. So if I start to talk really fast, it's helpful if somebody just indicates, like, take it easy. I have a lot of notes and I have a lot of information, and sometimes I get a little bit more excited in my brain than my mouth can process all at one time. So it's good just to kind of rein that in. So I'll put that out there at first. So I also want to say thank you to Jeremy and to Tri-Faith for the opportunity to participate in this. More of which I'll get into when I talk about the reasons why I selected this story and my experience with this story going forward. So, oh, my screen just changed. Okay, so I'm spotlighted. Excellent. Okay, so I selected this story of Bathsheba for a number of reasons. One, because of all the stories that I have experienced in my faith journey, which is a Christian path for the most part over the span of my life. It has been primarily a Christian path. And so a lot of my foundational faith stories came from the Christian Bible, both from the Old Testament and of course from what we would call the New Testament. And my first experiences with the story of Bathsheba are, and my understanding of this story when I first encountered it is wildly different than my understanding of it now. And you know, a lot of that stems from a regular way that we interact with scripture as we grow and learn. And I thought it would be really interesting to hear from others gathered on this call some details of this story that could further evolve how these characters operate within our foundational faith stories. So I'm excited to talk about that because honestly, what we're provided for the part of this story, I'm going to talk about what we're provided in the Christian Bible isn't a lot. And what I found was that in different translations of the Christian Bible, there's a couple of word changes that don't really change the story, but they add some nuances as we understand translations do, and they fit translators' agendas and things like that. So I found that to be interesting. I'm interested to hear what other details that the rest of you can add to this as well. Another reason why I chose this story is that as the director of youth and family ministries, when I approach scripture stories, one lens that I use is how do we as a congregation pass these stories on to our youth and children with truth and with messages and with meaning that they're able to take then into their life, and how we integrate these stories and how they inform our faith into how we interact with the world around us. So that's another reason. And then the third reason is that as a seminary student, I'm in seminary at Chicago Theological. We spend some amount of time talking about not just the historical context or the interpretations of these stories, but the impact that these stories have on folks who hear them, and maybe who aren't hearing them in the scope of an academic class or in a group like this, or in another form of study, but folks who are sitting in a congregation, hearing this story and hearing how we react and present this story, and how that impacts their own life experiences. So with that being said, I do want to just issue a bit of a content alert. So we are going to be talking about an aspect of the story of Bathsheba and David, and we're going to talk about rape and sexual assault. So if you are not in a space to engage with those topics, please take steps to care for yourself in a meaningful and significant way. If that means you need to leave, that's fine. If it means you need to shut off your camera, if it means you need to not participate, also fine. But I wanted to be sure that I gave everyone that opportunity, because we are going to talk about it. And we are going to hold space for those difficult narratives. Everybody continue? We can continue? Excellent, excellent. Okay, so part of what I wanted to talk about today was my own personal experience with this story, and how it has evolved in my mind. So before I tell you my experience, I'm hoping some of you would be willing to share your very first experience with the story of David and Bathsheba. So I don't mean like how you interpreted it this time when you read it, but if you can remember the first time that this story was offered to you, or you were introduced to this story, and how it was done.
So I'll start. So what I remember is a fairly, let's see, trying to remember the exact how the story goes. I'm not sure how many people were able to read it in advance.
Oh, okay.
But so maybe we want like a very summarized version of it.
Yeah.
But maybe Joanna would like to add. Actually, I'll pass it off to her first.
Hi, thank you. So I don't remember exactly how old I might have been when experiencing this story, but I kind of remember like, oh, she was so beautiful, and David he just thought she was amazing, and how wonderfully romantic this was. And like then we kind of really shifted focus to like the prophet Nathan and like speaking truth to power, and like, you know, what David did wrong with Bathsheba's husband, right? Like, but we did not really enter into any conversation about whether the David Bathsheba relationship was problematic. Only the David husband Nathan communication relationship.
Yeah, and that fits for me too. I was just thinking that question is really provocative. I don't think I read this story as a child or a teenager at all, but probably at age 11 or 12, saw the movie with Susan Hayward, and she was, as Joanna said, such a babe. And I interpreted that as this great love story. It was a real shock to read it as an adult. Okay, there you go. And the focus was on David, not on the women.
I think we have an answer in the chat. Jeremy, do you manage that or do I manage that?
I don't see any, so it might be you directly.
Oh, it is directly to me. I'm going to read it. Okay, so another comment was she was beautiful and David wanted her as his wife, even though she was married. Yep. And so David made sure her husband went off to the military campaign where he got killed. Yep. And we'll talk about that when I sum up this story. And there's a reason why I asked for people's experiences with this story before I talked about the story. Because for me, as a grade school student, which was the first that I was introduced to this story, and it was done by my CCD teacher, and this person made it very clear that Bathsheba was the catalyst for David's downfall. So as we read this story, things they start to go not great for the house of David after this. And the way it was presented to me as a grade school student was that she was singularly responsible for this. And that's a lot for a grade school student to carry. But it's significant enough for me that it stayed with me. And as I kind of wrestled with this story as I got older, things became clear, and it caused a lot of problems for me on my own faith journey as foundational scripture stories. So here's the story. I'm going to sum it up as it happens in the Christian Bible. And if it seems short, it's because it really is for this level of event. It's a very short story. So I'm going to dive right into it. So Bathsheba is bathing on her roof of her house and is seen by David the king as he walks in the palace on a kingly sojourn outside, and he sees her, and she is described as being very beautiful, and depending on the translation you read, David either likes her or
Froze.
What's up?
You froze. David likes her or what?
I froze. Can you hear me now? Are we good? He likes her or he lusts after her, which is kind of a significant difference, because lust certainly implies some other intention. So he lusts after her and he sends out folks to figure out who she is. Once he figures out who she is, he sends folks out again to bring her to him. Now, this is where the story gets pretty glossed over, and he rapes her. And depending on how, which translation you're reading, it's represented as he lays with her, they have sexual intercourse, and even in one translation, it skips directly to her being pregnant because of the events that have transpired after she was brought to him. So then she's pregnant, and David finds out she's pregnant and has to figure out how to get Uriah on board with this pregnancy so that there isn't any suspicion. So Uriah comes home and David tries unsuccessfully to convince him to sleep with his wife, but he refuses for a number of reasons. And when presented with this refusal, repeated refusal, David then strategically sends Uriah to the front to a place where he will most likely be killed, and he is killed. And then he brings Bathsheba to the palace as one of his wives. I'm pretty sure that's all in 11 through 12, which I think is what everybody was going to read. A little bit further on in the story, that initial pregnancy is lost. She becomes pregnant again and eventually gives birth to Solomon, who will become King Solomon. So a couple of interesting things about Bathsheba's character. I also want to mention that all of the things that I will talk about today are accessible to anybody. Initially, when I was thinking about this story, I went to some of my textbooks from school, to some of our class discussions for my Hebrew Bible class in seminary. But what I wanted to make sure I did when I came today was to be able to use information that people could access very easily on their own through Google searches, through a search at the library. I don't know if anybody's going to ask for resources, but you have them already. And Google is your friend. Just check your sources. Oh my goodness, check your sources. So I absolutely lost my train of thought. Anyway, so there's a number of things that we know about Bathsheba and or that we believe about Bathsheba that scholars have said that A, she was of noble birth. B, that the bath she was taking was actually a ritual bath after her menstrual cycle. So she was engaging in some religious rituals. And for Christians, she is Jesus's link to the house of David, which makes her a pretty significant character for fans of Jesus. She is mentioned one time in the Gospels, in the Gospel of Mark, and she is not even mentioned by name. She is mentioned only in the genealogy of Jesus as the wife of Uriah. And it's important because as we write these female characters out of significance, that's one way that it happens, right? We stop saying their names and we carry on the names of others deliberately. Totally different topic. So it's significant for us to be able to talk about how this story is presented in our faith. So as I said, as a grade school student, I carried this idea that Bathsheba was responsible for the fall of David's reign. What happens in the Christian Bible after this event is Nathan confronts David as a good friend would confront us when we are doing things that are damaging, traumatic, illegal. We should hope to have such good friends who can talk to us in this way. And Nathan is confronted. David sees the error of his ways, but things continue to happen in their life. For example, the very next chapter, David's sons rape a member of their family. And so we see this pattern already beginning to be established within this family. Bathsheba later conspires with folks to get Solomon as the king, which adds some flavor to her character, which I appreciate, especially when we consider everything that she has been through. So when I got into high school was the very first time that I ever read this story on my own, because we needed to for class, for our Old Testament class. And this was one of the stories that we read. And what I had been taught as a young student in grade school didn't match what we were being asked to read. And our conversations skipped over that part, as Joanna had mentioned, right? What we talk about is David's story, David's actions, and then David's redemption. And we never talked about Bathsheba. And this was significant to me because it was obvious. I went to an all-girls Catholic high school. And so we were made very aware of how women exist in the world. And things we needed to be cautious about, and situations that we needed to avoid. And they started that very early with us, which I'm grateful for. But to hear a story like this and to see what looks like a dangerous situation for a woman absolutely glossed over, created a break for me with these foundational stories and my faith journey. So, and Joanna did answer this a little bit, but my next question is just to offer for just a moment, if anyone else it would be willing to share their experience on when they realized, or if they realized, or if this is the first time that you're hearing that what we're presented with this story may not match what's in this story. Does that question make sense? These are tough questions. To be fair, I came prepared with like some, they're a little bit mean.
I'll dive in. I too grew up Catholic and Catholic grade school, as a matter of fact. And so I never, ever heard these stories because we were only told the stories from the Bible that the priest wanted us to hear. And we were never encouraged to read the Bible. As a matter of fact, we were told in Catholic school not to read the Old Testament because, and priests are still saying this, because it was replaced by the New Testament. So when I left the Catholic Church and became a Protestant, of course, what did I want to do first? Read the Old Testament. What's in there that they don't want me to know? And okay, yeah, here's the story they didn't want me to know. And the more I read it, the more I think about what a schmuck. And not only, if you read between the lines, it was David who had the palace built. David had the location selected. David chose a place somehow where he could look down on the women bathing. So it strikes me that I'm trying to find some balance in between that and this is the guy that God chose.
Yeah, and I would say in my Protestant Christian heritage, by the time this story was actually even talked about, it was presented as, again, David-centric, that he indeed was a sinner, but God can use any of us. We don't have to be perfect, which was a nice message, but really no emphasis on Bathsheba at all, except as a beautiful temptress. So.
And I think that's something that we often hear, like temptress or adulteress, seductress are some of the ways that Bathsheba has been labeled. And yeah, Rabbi Solar.
So I was just looking through the commentary from the Jewish tradition here on this passage, and what I'm seeing just at a short glance of it is that there's a tradition in Jewish interpretation that Bathsheba was divorced from Uriah by the time this all happened, so that she wasn't actually, there was no prohibition there involved. So, I mean, that's not uncommon, for the sages of Judaism to do that kind of, justification of the heroes. But I just found that there.
Nice, thank you. And there is some information in the chat if folks didn't see it about Jason. I'm just going to read this. Hopefully that's okay. Jason shared that he heard of it as a lust sending husband to die, as lust sending the husband to die, and it was in the middle of school I think your school, Jason, and David was blamed for his own downfall. There wasn't any mention of consent or power dynamics. And that is super important. And there's reasons why it's even more important today. Now, how this story happens in my brain, and some of you, maybe you can relate to this as well, is that I see this pattern being repeated in our contemporary time. And that's another reason why talking about this story is significant, especially as we see men in power, and I'm going to reference men specifically because those are the characters in our story today. But when we see men in power using that position to engage in this consentless, in these consentless acts, especially sexual acts. Just in the last few years, I'm sure that we can all think in our minds of men in power who it has come forward that these things have happened, and we do as a society kind of perpetuate this idea of A, figuring out how to rescue our heroes, and B, figuring out how to move past the reality of what has happened as quickly as we can. And in the process of doing that, we often leave folks behind, and that is important to me as a seminary student because if I am going to move forward in my life and just be able to discuss these stories with congregants, with other people, I want to be able to hold space for the events that are described. And if a person has experienced this same thing in their life, to hear this in our church up in the sanctuary, the effects of that can be very difficult, right? And to stop and to honor where Bathsheba, where she's coming from, her experiences, to honor the fact that she is in this story, that what happened to her is important and it informs how we understand the rest of the story. The other complicated thing is that we can hold space for these events and be honest about it and talk about it in the sense of David raped her, David had her husband murdered, then David brought her to live with him, and how we understand that dynamic and how we understand how that might have affected her life helps us figure out how these stories inform our faith. There's like a whole lot of stuff in the chat. So if somebody put something in the chat, would you like to just say it? If not, you don't have to, but do you want to just say it because it looks really good, and so it's helpful? Yes?
Yeah, sorry, I'm in an outdoor environment, so I was trying to keep it, it's pretty quiet at the moment, but yeah, the main thing that I got I grew up in a Jewish home, and most of the stuff I learned in Orthodox schools. And after reading about all the kings in general, it seemed to me that the whole thing was basically a treatise on why monarchy is bad, because it begins with the people calling the God, saying we want a king like the other nations, and God saying, oh, you want to be like the other nations? Well, okay, here's your king. And a lot of them were very flawed people, and a lot of bad things happened with the kings. There's a lot of mistakes, a lot of this is hardly a singular activity of one king making one mistake with one woman. There's a lot of things they did wrong, and it just showed that giving anyone that level of power is a bad idea. And it seems like I said, from what I got from it, the whole section of kings.
Did everybody lose him or just me?
I don't hear him either.
Okay. That's a really interesting point that that he brought up there, though, is that this is not an isolated incident in these stories, and it's still not an isolated incident. Most importantly, I know redemption is a big aspect of faith, and to recognize that people are flawed and that people make decisions that cause immense damage and incredible trauma to others, and those people are not beyond redemption. This story, if we hold it in the space of truth and honor all the characters involved, gives us an opportunity to not only honor Bathsheba's experiences, to recognize them, to love her as a character in the way we tell the story, in the way that we discuss the events that happened to her openly, with each other, with congregation members, with ourselves. If we're able to sit in that space of trauma with Bathsheba, we then can fill in all of the rest of the story and allow everybody else to enter into that story exactly as they are. We don't need to rescue our heroes. We can acknowledge that they are flawed. We can acknowledge also that we are flawed. And we can acknowledge that if they are not beyond redemption, then maybe we are also not beyond redemption, even when we make mistakes that are hugely damaging to others. I don't know about royal background, but noble background is what I found, Joseph. There's a question in the chat that asks if Bathsheba was from royal background. And I didn't find any confirmation that it was royal, but I did hear it was noble. So certainly royal after she became one of David's wives. Yep, you bet. So I want to ask a question that that's probably one of the most difficult questions that I'm going to ask, and it asks us to sit for just a moment and to consider the weight of this story. And I want you to think about if it changes the story as you understand it, to instead of implying or brushing over this this situation, this sexual assault, does it change the story for you to read it in that way, to hold space in the story for us to be able to acknowledge that this happened? Does it change it? And if yes, how does it change it? Let me give you some background why I'm asking this story. So as a little bit further down in my experience with this story, right? So we had grade school, we went to high school, and now in seminary, we did talk specifically about this story. And what happened with my peers in the class and with our professor was that people were very angry, and it changed the story for them. And their initial responses were very emotional. And if anybody understands how online learning works, so you post your initial response to it, other people respond, and you sort of have this very weird timed discussion that helps you kind of tease out what you are understanding about it, how it's functioning in your consideration of these stories with these characters and stuff like that. And I will say that the initial response was that people were surprised, to read this story and to consider that this was even a possibility. And that was reflected in their responses. And part of what happened in this space was that people were absolutely ready to throw the narrative of David away, which I am not advocating for. Again, what I'm hoping for is to be able to hold these stories that allow space for the people in these stories to be as human as they possibly are, and still connected to God, even in the places where we make mistakes, where we do things we wish we hadn't have done, and where they did things that they wish they hadn't have done, right? And we have these narratives where we see these humans being very human, and we see how the people in their lives help them work through it or not work through it. And I did see that in the postings as the week went on and people responded, and we didn't need to rescue the hero. David could still exist as the character that he was, as the person that he was, with this as part of his history. So that's what I mean a little bit, to have those kind of reactions. I'm wondering if anyone is having that. Are you having that right now? Because there's a lot of clergy on this call and they can help you work through this.
So this is Melissa. I'm a hospital chaplain. I'm ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which traditionally, my particular church is a little more on the progressive side and sees things in a little bit different way. And that's how I particularly kind of view it. For me, in reading this story, I think there are multiple perspectives that I think can be honored in it. Like so many of the stories in the Old Testament and in the Quran, and I think there's a lot of different ways that somebody can read it. It honors the story of the woman who is taken advantage of, and it honors the story of a man who struggles with lust, or it honors the story of somebody who meets somebody and then loves them and then gets themselves into a predicament. I think it can be seen in a lot of different perspectives, and our own experiences in our own lives affect the way that we respond to it. I have sexual abuse in my history, and that changes the way that I respond to it. And so I think we all too, while we read it from our own traditions, we also have to acknowledge from our own personal experiences how that shifts the way that we read and understand our story.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
And Beth Gershovich has her hand up.
I was just raising my hand to acknowledge that this version upset me, and I don't agree with it. Respectfully, I don't agree with it. That's all.
I am curious about redemption. I know people are, if redemption is available, but what I see so often with some of our powerful people is they're not seeking redemption, or they don't talk about that. And so did David and others, the kings of that time, seek redemption, or did they just keep on doing what they were doing?
Well, in this specific story, he does seek redemption.
He does. Okay.
At least with God, yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. After Nathan, after his conversation with Nathan, and Nathan is able to get across really the gravity of what he has done, he does seek out redemption. Yeah.
Thank
Becca?
you.
Yes.
So one of the other parts that I have struggled with in this story is the stillbirth, that there is some sort of godly punishment or evening out of sin that this child that was the result of this interaction is killed. And as a person who struggled with fertility, and certainly who knows many women who've had miscarriages and stillbirths and things like that, the notion that our Bible is teaching that is due to sin, that is that's very problematic for me, and working through, you know, how to reinterpret that, how to understand it differently, how to even comprehend what Bathsheba's suffering might have been, to have experienced what she experienced, prepare to have a child, be brought into the household of her king as a wife, queen, princess, I mean, whatever that might have meant to her, to then lose that child. I think it's one that I think we can really struggle with on a more theological, even than like who's our hero and what does that humanity mean.
Mhm. That's an excellent point as well, because what we understand now about grief and effects of grief and trauma on our bodies, um, I don't feel like we need to jump to this is a punishment from God. Just to understand the experiences that Bathsheba has in this short time period of her experience with David, of the death of her husband, uprooting her life and moving to this life in the palace with David. All of those things are significant stress. And what we understand physically about how stress works on the body, about our thresholds, about how we process grief, how we process traumatic events, any number of those things on their own is a traumatic enough event that could cause a person's body to react in a number of different ways. And so I appreciate you bringing that up very much. That's a significant thing to think of. And another reason why it's so important to acknowledge all the aspects of this story, because I don't think that's a reasonable like conclusion to come to, that she lost the baby. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Again, I very much feel that God cries too in those situations as opposed to causing them.
And we have a number of things in the chat. So Susan Stein mentioned something about Bathsheba in paintings. And in my research, I learned that Bathsheba is like one of 3 women that's painted naked. In a vast majority of images where she's depicted, she's naked. So that's significant. And all of these aspects of how these characters are portrayed feed into that narrative that is located in our inner libraries, and those stories work on us, you know, in our subconscious, and inform how we interpret information that comes in. So that's an interesting point, Susan. Amal had a really great point in the chat, and I'm wondering if she'd be willing to share it. Are you still with us, Amal?
I think that she had to leave.
Okay. So Amal shared a good point. I'll just read it. She said the story does not fall in the same line as in her scripture. For respect to our prophets. Okay, she was unable to listen. Islam only has the highest regard of the prophets. They are considered the most noble people, and they are always represented that way in the Quran. David and Solomon are the most noblest prophets in the Quran. In the Quran, David has the most beautiful voice, and he always praised God with his beautiful voice. And also he fasted every other day. And the Prophet Muhammad said that God gave David, that gave David as being one of the best examples of prophets. So that's another interesting aspect. So, so that leads us to this other question. Does it negate what David represents and the influence that David had on the development of our faiths to understand that that this is part of his story as well as Bathsheba's?
So, as far as I understand in Islam, and someone correct me if I misspeak here, this story is not in the Quran. That's part of why it's different. And that's, so when you remove, when you don't have this story, it can
Right.
change the interaction between Bathsheba and David pretty dramatically.
If I can, I did find a reference here. Now, I'm not an Islamic scholar by any means, but it says here in chapter 38, and it was said unto him, O David, lo, we have set thee as a vicegerent in the earth. We appointed you a prophet king for the children of Israel. Therefore, judge aright between mankind, judge justly between people, and follow not desire. Lo, those who wander from the way of Allah, from the obedience of Allah, have an awful doom, for as much as they forgot at the day of reckoning, because they forsake working for the day of reckoning. So that's one of the references. It's not the story in and of itself.
I think we only have about 10 minutes left, so I do want to take an opportunity before more people have to kind of skip off to say how very much I appreciate all of you being willing to sit in this absolutely uncomfortable space with these very hard stories. I think it is easy for us to pick out the stories that we like the best, the stories that even with hard things are easy to talk about. But I think it's necessary for us to hold these difficult parts of the story in. I think it's important for us to acknowledge them and for us to let them exist and inform how we move forward. At least for myself, I want to be able to do that. I want to not have to discount a story, right? Of significant character in our faith foundation. David is a significant character. So in my own mind, part of processing the story with you all is a need to hold accountable when we need to hold accountable. And when we work out these stories in our faith, it helps us practice doing that in our life. And it helps us walk with people as they seek redemption, or walk with people as they are held accountable, or walk with people as they need to hold others accountable. And we can do that in a space of love and companionship. So I very much appreciate that everyone was willing to do this with me today.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any particular discussion questions or anything? We do have some time. Yeah.
I just wanted to bring up the work that Jewish midrashic material works with David. And so part of my thesis was Satan in rabbinic Judaism. So there was about 300 pages work in order to be able to get ordination in Cincinnati. And I was shocked to see how Satan was brought into Jewish text. So with regard to Bathsheba, she was bathing on the roof of the palace, but there were many beautiful pots with flowers that separated between her and the eye of David, until Satan, who constantly is trying to challenge all of God's creatures, decided to intervene, and he shot an arrow in one of those pots. And at that moment, the pot broke down in the bottom of the palace. And at that moment exactly, David saw her naked. And so you can always blame Satan for everything.
Yes.
So I found it interesting how some of those biblical heroes, when they go through a plastic surgery in later midrashic material, they get always some way to cleanse themselves. So there's so many layers here in the story. And I think we need to do excavations and remove every layer in order to be able to get to some kind of truth, even if it's momentarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that idea of excavation. And in order to excavate it, we need to hold it up and acknowledge all of the different parts and acknowledge where we can dig. We got to have some kind of map to dig. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Also, it's good to see you.
You know, I think what this raises for me is, you know, regardless of your particular interpretation of this story, you know, the message behind what you're talking about is extremely important for all religious communities. You know, the idea that, you know, we need to be more conscious of people in power and their relationship with sexual power, basically. You know, this story is one opportunity to learn and talk about that in a religious environment. But the concept, you know, is something that is maybe even more relevant than even the particular interpretation.
Could I just say that I loved Steph's comment in the chat about, do you want to read it, Steph?
My favorite suffragist is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she got mad, I think, about many things in the 1800s. And she wrote a commentary with her other suffragist friends called the Women's Bible, and they fixed it. So anything in the Hebrew or Christian scriptures with a woman in it, they wrote their own commentary.
Oh, I need that.
Yeah, my favorite cello teacher gave this to me as a seminary graduation present. And so parts of it include, this was one of the most cruel deeds of David's life, which was marked by so many acts of weakness and crime. Now, just please remember, she's a very specific woman here who's very angry about all kinds of things. So just forgive her for a moment for her context. But the part that I was intrigued by is she says, no magnet is so powerful as the relationships of people. Men and women rise and fall together. This is one lesson which the Bible illustrates over and over. The degradation of women degrades men also. And of course, she doesn't know about trans people or homophobia when she writes this, but I thought that was really interesting that her take-home message is that, for me, when we harm one another, other people, we harm ourselves as well. And I thought that was a really interesting way for her to frame that.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you.
I was also thinking of when I was in graduate school at St. Louis U, I studied a poem by John Dryden, and it's Absalom and Ahithophel. And it just presents such a tragic depiction of David, whose son Absalom rebels against him. And he's a beautiful, beautiful youth. And he is caught fleeing in battle during this rebellion against his father. And against David's will, he is executed. And so that death, in a sense, mirrors or simply definitely recalls that of Uriah. and goes back then to David's early errors, mistakes, crimes. And then you have another battle scene later in his life. So I came away from that that course thinking of David in these very sympathetic ways, more than thinking of his whole life. So just wanted to add that.
Well, it looks like we're very close to time. I want to mention here that Wendy has posted a link for us on shareomaha.org. It is Do Good Week, and there's a wide range of opportunities to participate in Tri-Faith, whether it's donating, volunteerism, continuing to support our programs by attendance. Definitely look into that and look at our website as well. Also, a big thank you to Rebecca. I think this was a great conversation, a difficult conversation, but an important one. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to prepare and come talk to us about this. As always, remember to keep an eye on all of our programs coming up, including the next one, which if you want to save it on your calendars, it will be on May 18th at noon. So, and I will send out a reminder of that program as soon as it's up. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.